She married a 75-year-old sheikh to save her family. But on her wedding night, something happened that no one expected. Don't forget to subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The hills of southern Portugal were always quiet in early spring, when the vines still slept under the mist and the air carried the scent of cold stone and tired soil. In the Ferreira family estate, time felt slower, not in the peaceful sense of timelessness, but in the strained silence of waiting for a verdict already known, for a blow already mid-swing. Adelina stood barefoot on the tiled floor of the old dining room, her fingers pressed lightly against the wooden window frame, watching the sun melt through the fog. She didn't know it then, but this would be one of the last mornings she spent in her family home with any illusion of safety. Her mother's voice broke the silence from the hallway, soft and brittle like the edge of broken glass. "You should eat something, meu amor," she said, her Portuguese accent thickening with worry. Adelina didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her mother knew by now that her daughter had been retreating further into herself with every passing day. Downstairs, the estate manager was already packing files into a cracked leather briefcase. His voice carried through the floorboards, low and clipped. Adelina could make out her father's deeper responses, lined with a forced calmness that did little to mask his despair. 4 months he had pretended the vineyard was only going through a rough season. Pretended the wine auctions were just slow to rebound after a dismal year. Pretended the debt notices were just administrative mistakes. But the truth had arrived, signed and sealed. The vineyard was bankrupt. The Ferreira estate, a heritage spanning 4 generations, was to be sold off piece by piece unless something, anything, was done. Adelina finally turned from the window, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She padded down the hallway with slow, deliberate steps, her bare feet silent against the stone. She paused at the top of the stairs, listening to her parents' voices. Her father's tone had shifted, firmer now, determined in a way that made her uneasy. "There is a way out," he said, "a solution." Her mother's breath caught audibly. "You can't mean it. She's only 18. "She's a woman, not a child," he replied, "and we have no other choice." Adelina's pulse quickened. She descended the stairs without making a sound, her fingers grazing the curved railing. She turned the corner just as her father opened the double doors to the study. His eyes met hers. They were tired, bloodshot, but resolute. "Come," he said, "you need to hear this." The study was warmer than the rest of the house, the fire lit as if to soften what was about to be said. A man waited by the fireplace, tall, lean, dressed in an immaculate gray suit that made him look more like a diplomat than a businessman. He bowed his head slightly as Adelina entered. "Miss Ferreira," he said in perfect Portuguese, "my name is Karim Al-Baz. I represent His Excellency Emir Khalid bin Al-Faisal." The name meant nothing to her then, but the weight of it hung in the room like dust in sunlight. Karim reached into a briefcase and drew out a folder, which he placed on the table with quiet precision. "His Excellency is prepared to offer immediate assistance," Karim continued. "All debts cleared, the estate preserved, your family's name protected. In exchange, he requests a marital union with you, a formal alliance." Adelina stared at the folder. Her father's silence was louder than any words. "You're selling me?" she said quietly. "No," her mother whispered. "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that," Adelina interrupted, turning sharply toward her father. "Isn't it?" Her father exhaled slowly. "It's a contract, yes, but you'll be protected, honored. He's a man of great influence." He's 72, she snapped. I'm 18. Kareem didn't flinch. This is a symbolic marriage, Miss Ferreira. His Excellency is a statesman. He requires a partner of dignity and grace to accompany him in ceremonial affairs. Nothing more is expected of you. Adelina's vision blurred with anger and disbelief. So, I'm to be a statue, a well-dressed puppet on his arm? You're saving this land, her father said. Your family's legacy. Adelina laughed bitterly. No, you're saving your pride and throwing me away to do it. Her mother's hands trembled as she reached for her daughter's. Please. You know how hard this year has been. We can't lose the vineyard. It's everything we have. Adelina pulled away, stepping back until her spine pressed against the wall. She wanted to scream, to shatter every glass in the room with her fury, but instead her voice came out hollow. And what do I have? Kareem closed the folder and placed a gold pen on top. You have time to consider, but not much. The auction is scheduled in 2 weeks. He bowed again and left the room, his exit as silent as his arrival. That night, Adelina sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the folder. Her fingers hovered over the seal but never opened it. Instead, she curled into herself, her cheek against the worn blanket she had since childhood, and let the silence drown her. The next morning, she tried to find a way out. She contacted an old school friend in Lisbon, reached out to a distant cousin studying abroad, but doors closed as quickly as they opened. Her father had already frozen the accounts. Her passport was locked in the family safe. The 4th day after Kareem's visit, the local bank issued the final foreclosure notice. Adelina walked into the study without being called, pulled the folder into her arms, and set it down in front of her father. I'll do it, she said. Her mother cried silently in the corner. Her father nodded, not in triumph, but in surrender. The wedding was to take place in 3 weeks. The contract was translated into French, Arabic, and Portuguese, notarized and bound in gold. The terms were clear. She would relocate to the Emirates, remain married for a minimum of 3 years, and be publicly recognized as Emir Khalid's wife. Any heirs would be protected and recognized. A discreet clause written in small text noted that physical consummation was at the emir's discretion. She signed with a hand that did not feel like her own. The days that followed were mechanical. Tailors arrived to measure her. Stylists brought swatches of silks and perfumes. A diplomat from the UAE embassy delivered her visa personally. Each gesture was courteous, polished, and detached, no different from the auctioning of a prized mare. On the morning of her departure, her father embraced her for the first time in years. His voice cracked as he said, "You're strong, Adelina. Stronger than all of us." She didn't cry. She boarded the private jet alone, her luggage marked with a golden crest she didn't recognize. The sky over Portugal was overcast, but above the clouds, it was blindingly clear. Adelina pressed her forehead to the window and whispered to the clouds, "Don't forget me." When the wheels left the earth, so did the last of her illusions. She wasn't flying to a new life. She was being delivered. As the engines roared and the sky darkened toward the horizon, Adelina closed her eyes. Somewhere below, the vineyard grew smaller and smaller until it vanished altogether. The flight lasted nearly 7 hours, though time seemed suspended in the sealed cocoon of the private jet. Adelina didn't speak to the flight attendants, nor did she touch the tray of delicacies arranged in front of her. Instead, she stared through the window, her reflection caught faintly against the darkening sky. Below, entire continents passed unseen. When the plane descended, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over a landscape unlike anything she had known. Flat desert melting into a polished skyline of gleaming domes and glass towers. They landed in complete silence. A man in a charcoal suit met her at the foot of the stairs. He didn't speak. He only offered a shallow bow before gesturing toward a black armored vehicle with tinted windows. Two others followed behind. No one explained where they were going. Adelina climbed in and sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her nails pressing crescents into her palms. The door shut with a muted finality. The engine purred to life, and the convoy pulled away from the airstrip into a city bathed in heat and shadows. Through the window, Adelina watched as they drove through wide boulevards lined with imported palm trees and fountains that sparkled in the fading light. The architecture was both ancient and futuristic. Minarets beside skyscrapers, marble facades beside mirrored walls. She saw children playing near a market stall, women in vibrant abayas laughing, old men sipping tea in shaded alcoves. The city was alive. Alive in a way she hadn't expected, as though the world had decided to continue without her. The car turned off the main road and passed through the wrought iron gates into a private estate so vast it took another 10 minutes just to reach the entrance. The palace loomed ahead, a masterpiece of opulence. Domed rooftops covered in gold leaf, ivory columns, and stained glass windows depicting intricate geometric patterns. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Inside, the air smelled of rosewater and incense. The floors were marble, cool and veined like frozen rivers. A woman in a lavender veil bowed as Adelina stepped out of the car. Another handed her a glass of water she didn't drink. They led her down a hallway so long it felt like the corridors of a museum. Past rooms filled with carved furniture and velvet cushions, past tapestries so old they must have been hung by hand. "This is the women's wing," one of them said gently. Her English was formal, precise. "It is yours now, madam." Adelina said nothing. She was shown to a suite more extravagant than anything she had ever imagined. The bed was framed in gold, the ceiling painted with stars, the bathtub carved from a single piece of marble. On the vanity lay a set of jewelry, diamonds, emeralds, pearls, and beside it, a silk box containing a handwritten note in Lupin Arabic. She didn't need a translation. The gesture spoke clearly: welcome, belong, obey. That night, she did not sleep. She walked barefoot across the polished floor, counting her steps to calm herself. The walls, though soundproofed, felt too quiet. There were no distant church bells here, no rustling vineyard leaves. Only the occasional soft shuffle of footsteps outside, like shadows passing between one cell and another. When she finally lay down, she kept her eyes open, staring at the domed ceiling above her bed, its painted constellations indifferent to her presence. Morning came without color. A bell chimed faintly, and 3 women entered carrying breakfast. They addressed her as Lady and explained her schedule in gentle tones. She would meet the royal seamstress, be measured for the wedding garments, receive instructions in etiquette. Adelina nodded, her voice lost somewhere in her throat. The seamstress arrived at 10. She was French-Algerian, talkative, and unfazed by Adelina's silence. She flitted about with measuring tape and bolts of fabric, speaking of silks, embroidery, and wedding customs. "You'll be magnificent," she said, "a jewel among pearls. His Excellency is most particular, but I think he will be pleased." Adelina didn't ask what that meant. She already understood that everything here served a performance. She was the centerpiece. As days passed, the pace intensified. Designers came and went. Embroiderers knelt at her feet, Jewelers laid out trays of rings and bangles like offerings. She was fitted, polished, instructed, and groomed as though preparing not for marriage, but for display. Her every move was under gentle surveillance, never overt, but omnipresent. She could feel the eyes watching from behind curtained halls, could sense the silent judgment in every bowed head. Once she tried to ask a servant about the emir. "When will I meet him?" she ventured. The servant, a young girl no older than herself, only smiled nervously and replied, "Soon, madam. He is eager." The answer chilled her. Eager. The wedding date was set for the following week. She was given a handwritten schedule, every hour planned. Language lessons, cultural briefings, physical relaxation sessions in the hammam. She obeyed without resistance. There was no room for rebellion in a place like this. Even her solitude was curated. Windows that didn't open, doors that locked from the outside, gardens enclosed in high walls with no visible exits. At night, she wrote letters she would never send. Pages of thoughts folded and hidden in the drawer of a vanity she didn't own. She wrote to Monica, her childhood friend, to her mother, whom she no longer trusted, to M, only his initial, because writing his full name hurt too much. "I am a stranger here," she wrote once, "not just to them, but to myself." The day before the wedding, a ceremony rehearsal was held in the great hall. Adelina was walked down an aisle lined with gold and ivory. Artificial petals fell from a balcony. Musicians played a traditional melody she didn't know. When she reached the end, an empty space waited beside the officiant. "He will be here tomorrow," someone whispered. Adelina bowed her head and practiced her smile. That night, she was bathed by attendants in perfumed water. Her hair was oiled and braided. A box was brought to her room. Inside it, the wedding dress, ivory silk threaded with platinum, fitted perfectly to her frame. It shimmered like a river under moonlight. In the morning, they dressed her in silence. The veil was pinned, her hands painted with henna, her wrists laced with thin gold chains. She looked into the mirror and barely recognized herself. The girl staring back was regal, unearthly, but behind the eyes, vacancy. The wedding began at noon. Dignitaries, government officials, and family members arrived in fleets of polished cars. Cameras were not allowed. Privacy was sacred. Adelina was escorted into the hall by two older women she didn't know. Her steps were light, too practiced, too slow. At the far end of the hall stood her husband-to-be. Emir Khalid bin al-Faisal was tall, broad-shouldered, his posture erect with military discipline. He wore traditional robes of deep navy and gold. His face was angular, clean-shaven, with sharp eyes that watched her intently. He did not smile, but he nodded once as she approached, acknowledging her as one might a beautiful possession. The ceremony was short, vows in Arabic she did not fully understand. A ring, heavy and cold, slid onto her finger. A kiss on the back of her hand. Dry lips, distant breath. Applause. A contract finalized. She was now Adelina bint Khalid, wife of the emir. That evening, after the guests had gone and the musicians had packed their instruments, Adelina was escorted to her new chambers. Not the same suite as before. This one was deeper in the palace, more secluded. A corridor of carved arches led to double doors gilded in bronze. Two maids opened them without a word. Inside, the room was darker, more intimate. Heavy drapes concealed the windows. The bed was larger, the sheets darker, the air heavier with perfume. Adelina stepped inside and heard the door close behind her. She stood still, uncertain, heart pounding. "He will come later," one maid said softly. The other added, "He prefers tradition." Then they left her alone. Adelina sat on the edge of the bed, her veil removed, the dress now replaced by a silken robe that revealed more than it hid. Her hands trembled. She watched the shadows shift on the floor as minutes passed, then an hour. The door handle turned. She inhaled sharply, bracing, but it was only the wind. The door hadn't moved. When sleep finally took her, it was shallow and dreamless. And when she woke at dawn, still alone in the bed, a strange mix of relief and dread filled her chest. She was untouched for now, but she was not safe. She was not free. She was exactly where they wanted her. And the gilded cage was closing, inch by inch. The first rays of morning filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long slivers of light across the polished floor. Adelina lay on the bed, still dressed in the pale silk robe she had been given the night before. She hadn't changed. She hadn't moved much. Her limbs felt too heavy, her chest too tight. She was not sure whether it had been hours or days since the ceremony. Everything blurred together now like pages smeared by damp hands. The silence had stretched on, not comforting but suffocating, and even in the echoing grandeur of the palace, she had never felt more small, more reduced. Servants came and went with quiet footsteps and trained expressions. They offered her fruit, tea, honeyed bread, and silver bowls of fresh water for washing. They adjusted the flowers in the vases, folded and refolded her gowns, lit soft, scented candles. They never spoke unless spoken to. None of them addressed the unspoken truth. The marriage had not yet been consummated. No one mentioned the empty side of the bed or the untouched lace canopy overhead. No one asked if she was afraid. But she was. Not of him, not yet, but of what this meant, what it delayed, what it foreshadowed. In the mornings, she wandered the enclosed gardens. It was the only place where she could breathe a little. The trees were trimmed into unnatural perfection, and fountains flowed endlessly in marble basins, but there was no breeze, no insects, no life outside what had been planted and controlled. Every turn of the path led back to the same beginning, like a circle with no exit. Still, she walked. It helped her forget for a while, but it was in the stillness, especially at night, that the past returned to her. Memory was not a kind visitor. It did not knock before entering. It arrived suddenly, uninvited, dragging along faces and voices that she had tried to leave behind. She saw M again, not in full, but in pieces. His hands brushing her hair back beneath the old cork tree on the vineyard hill, the way he'd call her little firefly when she pouted. His laugh echoing through the wine-press room when they had danced barefoot, drunk on cheap red wine and the thrill of being young. M had never been just a flirtation. He had been her first kiss, her first confession, her first everything, and her first betrayal. They had planned to leave, or at least talk about it. He wanted to study art in Porto, and she wanted to escape the suffocating expectations of her family. The night before everything fell apart, she had gone to him one last time. They had made love for the first and only time in the hidden storage barn behind the house. It had been clumsy, warm, real. She had cried afterwards, not out of pain, but out of something she hadn't had words for. Fear, maybe, or knowing. She had never told anyone, and within days she was no longer a girl dreaming of freedom. She was a commodity on a marriage contract. Now, 3 weeks later, and thousands of miles away, the memory returned not just as longing, but as unease. Her body felt strange, heavier, slower. Her stomach turned at the scent of perfumes she had once enjoyed. She hadn't had her cycle in over a month, but she had written it off as stress. Now, something deeper pressed on her chest, something undeniable. That afternoon, she fainted. It happened without warning. One moment, she was standing in the atrium with one of the housekeepers, selecting the embroidery pattern for a new robe, and the next, her knees gave way. She collapsed into the woman's arms, her vision swimming in bursts of white. When she came to, she was lying on her bed, a wet cloth on her forehead, and three unfamiliar faces surrounding her. One was a doctor. The others, she didn't know. They examined her quickly but thoroughly, muttering to each other in a language she barely understood. Blood pressure, heart rate, eyes, breath. Then the doctor turned to her and, with careful English, said, "We'd like to run a few routine tests. Nothing invasive. Please, don't worry." Adelina nodded, unable to speak. Her mouth had gone dry. The results came back the next morning. Pregnant. She heard the word as if it were said to someone else. The doctor was gentle, respectful. Approximately 5 to 6 weeks. Very early. You are otherwise healthy, but we recommend rest and care. He handed her a booklet with instructions in 3 languages. She didn't read it. She waited until they were gone before locking the door and sliding to the floor beside her bed. There, with her back against the cool wood and her hands cradling a stomach that showed no signs of life yet, she wept. Silent, dry sobs that left her empty and shaking. The baby was not the Amir's. And now everything would collapse. She didn't know what the punishment would be, but it didn't matter. Whether exile, dishonor, annulment, or worse, her life as it stood was over. This child, innocent and unknowing, was a truth her body could no longer hide. And the walls of the palace, so grand, so silent, had ears. The next day, Karim returned. He did not knock. He appeared like a shadow in the doorway as she sat at her writing desk, trying and failing to begin a letter. He looked more severe than usual, his eyes unreadable. "His Excellency wishes to speak with you," he said. Adelina stood slowly, steadied herself, and followed without question. She expected to be led to the Emir's study, but instead they went deeper into the palace, down a corridor she had never seen, past guards in ceremonial dress, into a room that resembled a conference chamber rather than a private space. The Emir stood at the far end, hands clasped behind his back, looking out through a stained glass window. He did not turn when she entered. "I hear," he said finally, "that you are with child." Adelina's breath caught in her throat. He turned then. There was no anger in his face, no emotion at all, only calculation. "Is it mine?" he asked. She said nothing. "Of course not," he continued, walking toward her. "We both know the wedding night never happened." Still, she didn't answer. What was there to say? He stopped a few paces in front of her. "Do you think I'm a fool, Adelina? Do you think I didn't know you came here with secrets?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze. "I should have you annulled, sent back disgraced. Let your family fall again," he said, voice still calm. "But I won't." She blinked, confused. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I want an heir. This child, whoever its father is, will serve that purpose. No one will question it. No one will challenge it. You will stay, you will carry the child, and when it is born, I will name it mine." Adelina recoiled. "Why?" "Because power does not care for purity," he said. "It cares for legacy." She trembled. "And if I refuse?" He smiled, the first time she had seen him do so. "You won't." He walked past her toward the exit. "Congratulations," he said before disappearing through the heavy door. She didn't faint this time. She stood still, her heart beat loud in her ears. She was being allowed to stay, but only as a vessel, a means to a dynastic end. The child would be used, paraded, controlled, and she would never be free again. Back in her room, she found a note left by one of the maids. Just a slip of paper, tucked under a jewelry box. "He is here." 3 words, no name. But she knew. M was in the city. She didn't know how or why. Maybe he had come looking for her. Maybe someone had told him. But the message was unmistakable. Hope, fragile and dangerous, bloomed in her chest, and with it the first whisper of rebellion. The days that followed moved like sand through clenched fists, slow, heavy, and impossible to grasp. Adelina remained confined to her wing, now under even tighter supervision. Servants no longer lingered in her rooms with soft expressions. They entered, completed their tasks, and left as silently as shadows. The food they brought was more substantial, more precise, nutritionist approved for pregnancy. Her wardrobe subtly changed, as if the silken robes and loose gowns she had worn before were no longer deemed appropriate for someone carrying a future heir. She hadn't spoken to the emir since that single conversation in the cold chamber, but his words hung in the air like perfume that would not dissipate. She would stay. She would carry the child, and he would name it his. No one knew the truth. No one dared ask. At night, she sat by the window of her bedroom, the one that looked out over the inner courtyard. From this high vantage point, she could see the main gates in the distance, the long stone path that curved through the private gardens, and the high outer walls that separated the palace from the city. She counted the guards. She noted the change of shifts. She noticed with a quickening heart that a man in plain clothing had begun appearing near the west wall, near the fountains. He did not speak to anyone. He did not stay long. But she recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, the shape of his posture. She didn't know how he had found her. Perhaps someone had leaked information. Perhaps he had come on instinct. But there he was, real and undeniable. He had crossed the world for her, and she could do nothing but watch. She wrote him letters she could not send. At night, she pressed her fingertips against the glass and imagined he could feel her presence. She ached for him in ways she couldn't even name anymore. Not just with desire or regret, but with a deep yearning for the version of herself that had once existed beside him. The girl with laughter in her throat and dirt on her hands. The girl who had danced barefoot under the stars. She was gone now. But M's presence pulled at her memory like a string trying to reel her back. The palace, however, was not blind. Karim began appearing more often. His glances were sharper, his questions less veiled. He asked about her sleep, her appetite, her walks in the garden. He brought in a new doctor who insisted on a more thorough exam. Adelina complied, her silence her only weapon. But she felt the scrutiny tighten around her like a noose. They knew something was shifting. They didn't know what. Then came the test. One morning, 2 women escorted her to a different part of the palace under the guise of fitting her for ceremonial garments. But instead of lace and silk, she found herself in a sterile room with white walls and no windows. A woman in a medical coat greeted her with a practiced smile. Behind her, another stood with a clipboard. "We will perform a routine confirmation," the woman said in English, her accent clipped. "A paternity test, standard precaution for state records." Adelina's heart dropped. She had not been warned. No one had asked for consent. This was no routine check. This was a trap. She froze. "It's too early," she said. The woman blinked. "Actually, it's not. Non-invasive prenatal tests are possible at this stage. Quite common." Adelina's mind raced. If the test happened, the truth would come out. She would be exposed. The emir's entire plan would crumble. And then, what? Retribution? Exile? Worse? She stepped back. I need to speak to my husband. The women exchanged a glance. This was authorized by him. Panic rose in her chest. The air in the room thickened. Her hands curled into fists. She thought of running, of screaming, of clawing her way out, but there was nowhere to go. The room was locked. The guards were outside. I don't consent, she said finally, her voice shaking. The doctor hesitated. It's not optional. But before the procedure could begin, a knock interrupted the room. Karim stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the doctor, then at Adelina. His Excellency has reconsidered, he said flatly. The test will be postponed. The women gathered their tools and left. Adelina stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. Karim stepped closer. You should be careful, madam. There are eyes everywhere, even for you. She didn't answer. She couldn't. That night, she sat awake until the moon climbed high and the palace fell into slumber. She moved through the corridor of her wing with the silence of a ghost, her bare feet careful on the mosaic tiles. At the far end, there was a narrow door that led to the library, a place rarely used since the emir had grown more reclusive. There, among the leather-bound books and dusty maps, she found a passageway hidden behind a carved shelf. She had discovered it weeks ago, a curiosity at the time. Now it was her only hope. It led to the garden wall. She waited for 3 nights, watching from the shadows until M returned to his usual place. On the 4th night, she took the risk. Wearing a plain abaya and veil, she slipped through the passage after midnight and emerged near the fountain where he stood. He didn't see her at first. His back was to her. She stepped forward, heart pounding. She whispered. He turned. She hadn't expected the rush of emotion that hit her. His face was thinner, his eyes older, but it was him. He moved toward her in disbelief, his hands reaching to touch her face as if to confirm she was real. Adelina, he breathed. She didn't cry. There was no time for it. She told him everything, quickly, in broken pieces. About the marriage, the pregnancy, the emir's ultimatum, the test, the surveillance. M listened, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. He had come to find her, yes, but he had never imagined this. He had believed she was being kept as an honored wife, not a prisoner in silks. I'll get you out, he said. She shook her head. It's not that simple. I'm watched. And the baby... We'll leave, he insisted. We'll disappear. But she knew better. She had seen what the palace could do. There was no such thing as disappearing from a man like Khalid. They met 3 more times, each time under the cover of night, each time more dangerous than the last. Adelina became adept at evading the guards, timing her movements, slipping through passages like a shadow. But the palace noticed. They always did. On the 5th night, as she returned from the garden, she found Karim waiting in her room. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her. And then, softly, he said, "You've seen him." She didn't deny it. Karim stepped closer, his voice low. "You're playing a dangerous game, madam. His Excellency may be ill, but his reach is not diminished." Adelina met his gaze. "Then why hasn't he stopped me?" Karim studied her. "Perhaps he wants to see how far you'll go." She turned away, her stomach twisting. "Or perhaps," he added, "he is already dying, and you are no longer a threat, but a burden to dispose of quietly." The next morning, the emir summoned her again. This time, he did not speak in riddles. "I have made my decision," he said. "The child will be mine in name only. You will remain until the birth. Afterward, you will be relocated. Your companion will not be harmed, so long as he disappears. Permanently." Adelina's throat burned. "And if I don't agree? Then I will ruin him. I will ruin his family. I will erase you from every place you have ever belonged." She stood, her fists clenched, her heart hammering in her chest. "You will not win," she whispered, but the emir only smiled, as if he already had. She left the chamber with her jaw set and her body trembling. The mask had fallen. The illusion of protection, of peace, of diplomacy, it was gone. What remained was the bare truth of power and possession, and in that moment, Adelina knew. She would not be hidden. She would not be silent. The rebellion had already begun, and the price no longer mattered. The palace grew quieter after the emir's final pronouncement, as though even the marble walls had been commanded to hush. Adelina returned to her quarters in silence, her body upright but her mind whirling. Every step echoed too loudly. Every shadow seemed thicker. She could not tell if she was being followed or merely imagining it. The air itself had changed, thicker, closer. She sat on the edge of her bed for hours, staring at the door, expecting someone to come, to drag her away, to lock her somewhere unseen. But no one came. 3 nights later, she was woken before dawn by a gentle knock. A maid entered, trembling, her eyes red. She carried a tray of tea and dates, but her voice quivered when she spoke. "You must come with me, madam." Adelina said nothing. She simply rose, dressed in silence, and followed. They walked through the halls, still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness, until they reached a chamber she had never entered before. The door was already ajar. Inside, men in black robes whispered urgently in Arabic, their voices low and rapid. A doctor stood at the center of the room, his face pale. In the corner, Karim stood with his arms crossed tightly against his chest, his eyes heavy. The emir was dead. Adelina didn't breathe for a moment. The words did not seem real, not in the way death should. No collapse, no wailing, no moment of reckoning. Just the announcement. Just finality. He had passed during the night, alone in his private suite. A heart attack, they said. It was over in minutes. And now, just like that, the throne was vacant. The power was fractured, and everything he had built began to dissolve before the morning light. A maid touched Adelina's arm gently. "They want you to dress," she whispered. "The funeral is this afternoon." Adelina nodded, though her thoughts spun in every direction. She did not cry. She did not speak. When she returned to her room, she stood in front of the mirror, removed her veil, and looked at herself for a long time. There were no visible changes yet. Her stomach was still flat beneath the silk. Her face was pale but composed. She felt as if a war had passed through her, but her reflection was calm. By midday, the funeral procession began. It was not public. It could not be. The emir had too many enemies, too many secrets. Instead, it was held in the inner sanctum of the palace gardens. White roses were draped across the columns. Clerics whispered prayers. High-ranking officials stood with arms folded. Not a tear was shed. Not a word was spoken to her. Adelina stood apart, dressed in gray, her eyes dry, her hands folded against her belly. She was not acknowledged, not embraced. No one even looked her way. But she remained still and proud, her chin high even when they lowered the casket into the earth and sealed it with gold-rimmed stone. By evening, the legal affairs began. She was summoned to a long hall with polished floors and mirrored walls, where the emir's lawyers waited. Men in tailored suits and dark expressions sat behind a wide table. At the center was a folder. She recognized it even before it was opened. The will. Karim stood beside her, unreadable as always. A translator was present, though most of the officials spoke English fluently. The head lawyer opened the file and began to read, his voice dry and firm. According to the will, dated 10 months prior and updated 6 weeks before his death, Amir Khalid bin al-Faisal declared Adelina, his legal wife, to be partial heir to his estate. The documents were precise. She would retain ownership of 2 estates in the northern province, 1 private residence in Europe, a portion of non-voting shares in a security firm, and a fixed lifetime annuity. The room shifted as the men reacted. "Impossible," one muttered. "She was his wife," another added cautiously. "It is valid under family law." The eldest son stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "She is carrying a child not of his blood. This is fraud." Karim stepped forward. "There is no evidence to support that claim. The union was legal, the marriage was recognized by the ministry. Until a paternity test proves otherwise, the estate stands." "She tricked him," hissed the son. "She obeyed him," Karim replied flatly. Adelina remained silent throughout. She did not flinch. She did not deny. She merely watched, knowing that silence was now her greatest shield. They dismissed her shortly after, requesting she remain confined to the palace until further notice. She returned to her wing, where the staff avoided eye contact and whispered as she passed. At night, she sat on the floor with the documents in her lap, running her fingers over the embossed seal. Her name, printed in Arabic and English. Her status, widow. Her title, partial heir. It felt like a costume draped over a body that didn't fit it. But she wasn't foolish enough to think it would last. The attacks began quietly. A leak to the press, an article in a Western tabloid, the girl who stole an emir's crown. A photograph of her from the wedding day, cropped to exaggerate her youth, her beauty, her strangeness in that world. Another article followed. Pregnant bride or political pawn, commentators speculated wildly. Some suggested witchcraft. Others claimed seduction. Some argued that the emir had gone mad in his final months, manipulated by a foreign girl. And then came the question that no one wanted to say aloud, but all whispered nonetheless, had the marriage even been consummated? Within days, online forums exploded with theories. Rumors spread like wildfire. Adelina was instructed not to leave her rooms. The garden was off limits. Her communication restricted. Karim visited once to deliver an envelope from the Ministry of Defense, a formal request for clarification on the nature of her pregnancy. "They will not pursue it yet," he said, "but you must be cautious." She nodded, too tired to argue. Her body was beginning to change. Her chest ached. Her mornings were filled with nausea. Her back throbbed. She couldn't sleep. And now, on top of everything, the world called her a liar, a seductress, a thief. But the greatest threat had not yet arrived. His name was Zahir, the youngest son, the one who had lived abroad. The one no one mentioned until he returned, silent and sudden, like a blade slipping through silk. Adelina first saw him from the window. He arrived in a black car, alone, dressed simply in a white shirt and slacks. No entourage, no announcement. His face was unreadable, angular, refined. His walk was slow, deliberate. There was nothing frantic or angry in him. He carried himself like a man who already knew what he would find. When he entered the palace, the guards stepped aside. He did not ask for permission to see her. He did not send a message. He simply waited. She saw him again the next day, standing at the end of the hallway. Their eyes met. He did not speak, nor did she. But in his gaze she saw something different. Not hatred, not desire, but calculation. He was here for answers, and she was running out of time. The air shifted the moment Zahir entered the palace. It wasn't dramatic. No public declarations or confrontations, no parade of lawyers or threats of litigation. He came alone, dressed modestly, with no visible insignia of power, but the silence that followed in his wake was unmistakable. The palace guards straightened as he passed. Servants turned their eyes to the floor, and the ministers who had once raised their voices at the mention of Adelina's name now spoke more carefully, watching his face for signs of intent. Adelina had never met him before. He had not attended the wedding. He had not returned during his father's illness, nor during the funeral, nor even in the early meetings of inheritance. He had been a distant figure in the shadows, the Western-educated son who had chosen exile over obedience. But now, with Khalid dead and the estate fragile, Zahir had come back, not as a grieving son, but as an observer, a reckoner. He wanted to understand what had happened, what had truly transpired in the final months of his father's life. The first time he approached Adelina, it was in the central garden, where she had been granted an hour of supervised air under the pretense of health. The guards remained close, but not intrusively so. She sat beneath a stone archway, a small bowl of dates beside her hands resting over the swell that had only recently begun to form in her lower abdomen. Her body was changing, and she felt it with every movement, the heaviness, the pull, the constant fatigue. But it wasn't just her body that was different. Something inside her had hardened, grown sharper, less willing to bend. He stood several meters away at first, watching her. She turned, slowly, aware of the scrutiny. Their eyes met. His were dark, unreadable, with the same calculated quiet his father had once wielded, but with something else behind them, a younger intensity, less patience, more heat. "May I?" he asked. She gestured towards the stone bench across from her. He sat without ceremony. For a while, they didn't speak. The wind stirred the vines climbing the arch. A bird sang briefly before darting away. Finally, he looked at her belly, then at her face. "My father died the night of your wedding," he said. She said nothing. "No autopsy," he continued. "No second opinion. Just a silent burial and a sealed report." Adelina kept her eyes on the horizon. It was his wish. "Or someone else's," he murmured. She turned to him then. "If you've come to accuse me, do it directly." "I haven't come to accuse you," he said calmly. "I've come to find the truth." Her jaw clenched. "Everyone claims to want the truth until it becomes inconvenient." "I don't mind inconvenient," Zahir said. "I mind dishonesty." He stood and walked away without another word. Over the next few days, he returned. Always briefly, always uninvited. Sometimes in the library, sometimes outside her quarters, once at the foot of the grand staircase where she stood waiting for Karim. He asked questions. Simple ones at first, about her health, her time with the emir, her life before the marriage. She answered some, others she deflected. He never pushed, but the more time passed, the more she felt the storm building behind his eyes. Zahir began his own investigation. He spoke with the palace staff, reviewed the wedding contracts, and requested access to his father's private correspondence. Lawyers hesitated. Ministers stalled. He reminded them who he was. Doors opened. One night, Adelina awoke to find a note slipped under her door. It was unsigned, written in elegant, slanted Arabic. You should know what he left behind. The next morning, she found Zahir in the archive room, surrounded by boxes and files that had not been touched in years. The room smelled of old ink and dry paper. He was seated at a desk, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, a half-drunk cup of bitter coffee beside him. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer her a greeting. Instead, he pushed a folder toward her. Inside were purchase agreements, transactions made months before her family's vineyard had officially gone into bankruptcy. Quiet acquisitions executed through offshore companies and foreign investors. Her family's property had already been bought, in pieces, by firms connected to Khalid. The financial pressure, the slow sabotage, the pull of creditors, it had all been engineered. Her marriage was not a rescue. It had been orchestrated from the beginning. Adelina felt the blood drain from her face. "He didn't save your family," Zahir said softly. "He dismantled it, and then offered you the illusion of salvation." She closed the folder with shaking hands. "He chose you long before he met you," Zahir added. "I found records, photos, reports, letters from his aides. He had watched you for years. You were never random." Adelina felt as though the room were tilting. The heat under her skin turned to cold. She sat slowly, unsure whether she would remain standing. "I didn't know," she said quietly. Zahir's eyes softened slightly. "I believe you." They sat in silence for a long time. The following days blurred together. Zahir's presence became constant, no longer just a silent observer, but a necessary ally. He protected her subtly, asserting himself when ministers questioned her, intercepting inquiries from the press, stalling the legal motions initiated by his older siblings. He did not promise her safety, but he created a barrier between her and the wolves circling outside the palace walls. And yet, something deeper began to stir. Adelina saw it in the way he lingered longer than necessary, in the questions he asked about her childhood, in the way his eyes followed her not with suspicion, but with something quieter, gentler. One evening, she found him waiting in the outer hall of her chambers. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her with a strange tension in his face. "I need to ask you something," he said finally. She waited. "The night of the wedding," he said. "Did it happen?" She stared at him. "I won't repeat it. I won't use it against you. I just need to know." Her lips parted, but the words didn't come immediately. When they did, they were a whisper. "No, it didn't." Zahir closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. "I thought so." She stepped back, her spine against the door. "Does it matter?" she asked. "It matters because you're alone in this," he said, "and you shouldn't be." He didn't move closer. He didn't touch her. But the moment between them shifted. The air pulsed with something unsaid, something dangerous and sacred. She opened the door and stepped inside. He didn't follow, but the next morning a package arrived at her chambers. Inside was a wooden box, and within it a collection of old photos of her family estate, before the debts, before the decay. A piece of her past that had been stolen, now returned. There was no note, but she didn't need one. Zahir had returned not to defend his father. He had returned to uncover him, and, maybe, to redeem something of his own in the process. The lot had changed. It wasn't only the way it filtered through the narrow windows of the palace, warmer and more forgiving, but something in Adelina's chest had softened. For weeks she had moved like someone sleepwalking, carrying, enduring, evading, but now, in the echo that followed Zahir's quiet revolt, she found herself breathing differently. She had not expected to feel protected again, not under this roof, not in a place that had stripped her name, her body, her very will. Yet here it was. Not safety, not entirely, but the faint architecture of it. She didn't trust it yet, but she recognized the feeling. Zahir never asked for more. He didn't press her with questions, didn't invade her solitude. He simply began to be present, in corners of her day, at the periphery of her silence. She'd find a second cup of tea on her tray without explanation, or hear his voice gently challenging a minister who dared insinuate her illegitimacy. She would walk in the garden and sense him behind her, not close, not intrusive, but near enough that she no longer flinched when footsteps echoed. And then came the change she could no longer ignore. It began with her body. The child began to grow in earnest, and with it came the exhaustion, the strange shifts in her center of gravity, the hunger, the tenderness. But more than that, it brought the undeniable truth into focus. Soon it would be visible to all. The quiet grace period of speculation and rumor was ending. Her shape could no longer be masked by loose gowns or artful draping. The palace would know. The world would know. And then the contract, that cursed clause. Buried in the wedding agreement was a single paragraph, one that had haunted her since the day Karim first slid the paper across the table. Should the wife of His Excellency be found pregnant with child not proven to be of His Excellency's lineage within 1 year of his death, any claim to inheritance, protection, or title shall be rendered null. She would lose everything, not just the estates, not just the security. She would lose the right to remain in the country, to claim sanctuary. And worse, the child, if deemed illegitimate under the court of the emirate, could be denied rights altogether. He or she would be branded as a shameful artifact of a broken line. And Zahir, as much as he tried, could not protect her from the law once that clause was triggered. She didn't tell him right away. It lived inside her like a stone, heavy and cold. She went through her days with a steady smile and perfect posture, rehearsing a version of herself that could remain dignified no matter what came next. But the silence began to press too deeply into her bones. It happened one night, just before the monsoon rains. She stood on the balcony of her quarters, the clouds rolling low and dark over the horizon. The scent of moisture crept into the marble halls. Lightning cracked far in the distance, silent for now, but brilliant against the violet sky. Zahir arrived without knocking. He stepped out beside her, his jacket unbuttoned, the top of his shirt damp from the early drops. "They're circling," he said softly. She didn't need to ask who. His siblings, the ministers, the press. They were waiting, watching, measuring the days since the funeral, estimating the truth. "I know," she said. "You'll have to make a decision soon." She turned to him, her hand unconsciously resting over her stomach. "I already have." The next morning, she requested a private meeting with the palace legal counsel, not her lawyers, his, the ones who had written the clause in the first place. Zahir stood beside her, silent, unreadable, but present. She signed the documents herself. A full and unconditional renunciation of her claim to Khalid bin al-Faisal's inheritance. She relinquished all property, titles, and annuities granted through marriage. She released the estates, the shares, the accounts. She did not contest. She did not explain. She signed with her full name, with unshaken hands, and handed the pen back without ceremony. Zahir's brothers smirked when they heard. "She finally broke," one of them said. "Took her long enough." But Zahir said nothing, only watched them. And something in his silence made them flinch. That evening, Adelina stood by herself in the palace library, staring at the wall of law texts written in 3 languages. The room was empty. She allowed herself one moment of collapse. Her knees gave way, and she sat on the floor, not crying, not weeping, but breathing in deep, controlled shudders. She had given it up. All of it. Not under force, not for survival, but by choice. And in that, she reclaimed what none of them had expected, her autonomy. The days that followed were quiet, not peaceful, but purposeful. She made arrangements to leave the palace, not under exile, but voluntarily. There was a small estate in the south of France, one of the older properties Khalid had abandoned years ago, left to decay. No one wanted it. The family had not even included it in the contest over the will. She had asked for that, and only that. They granted it with amusement. Let her go rot among the vineyards, they said. Let her hide. But Zahir followed. He didn't speak of love. He didn't speak of duty. He simply came. He arrived in France with a single suitcase and no title. He signed no papers, made no declarations. He walked into the crumbling villa where Adelina now lived and asked if he could stay. She didn't answer with words. She opened the door and stepped aside. They lived quietly. The estate was nothing like the palace. It was rough, stone-walled with creeping ivy and cracked floorboards. The windows whistled when the wind came through. The garden was overgrown, but it was theirs. It was enough. In the mornings, Adelina tended the herbs. Zahir repaired the gates. They moved around each other without performance, without fear. And slowly, the bruises began to fade. From her body, from her memory. Her belly swelled. The baby moved. At night, she would lie beside Zahir and press his hand to her stomach, feel his breath hitch as the tiny limbs shifted beneath her skin. "They'll try again," she said once. He nodded. Let them. But they didn't. The world had found a new scandal, a new widow, a new kingdom to devour. And Adelina, no longer married, no longer rich, no longer of use, was forgotten. Which was exactly what she wanted. They were married by a civil judge on the coast, in a sun-bleached municipal hall with no guests and no cameras. She wore a cotton dress. He wore his oldest shirt. There were no rings. Only a look. Steady, quiet, real. Afterward, they walked along the beach until the sun dipped below the horizon. She leaned against him, barefoot, the sand warm beneath her toes. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She looked up at him. "No, because this time I chose." The child was born on a rainy afternoon in early spring, a daughter, dark-haired, loud, full of fury and hunger. Adelina held her against her chest and sobbed for the first time in months, not from pain, not from fear, but from the terrifying, exquisite reality that she was alive, whole, free. Zahir sat beside her, his hand in her hair, his mouth against her temple. "She has your eyes," he whispered. "She has your hands," she replied. They didn't name her after anyone. They chose something new, something that belonged only to them. And when the child opened her eyes for the first time, staring at the world as if daring it to touch her, Adelina whispered a vow, not to the palace, not to the past, but to herself. She would never be caged again, not in gold, not in fear, not in someone else's name. Her life, her body, her voice, it all belonged to her now, and that was everything. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure to watch the next story. You won't want to miss what's coming next.